Okie dokie. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome down the security rabbit hole to another edition of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. It is I, Raph. It is that way, James. Hey, bud.
Good afternoon. Good evening. Good morning. Whatever it is to anybody. That's afternoon for us, I guess.
Good day, sir. Good day. It is James. Is it summer already by you? We went from like winter to a quick jaunt into spring, and then somehow we fell back into like late like somewhere between spring and winter, and we've skipped everything. Now we're straight into summer.
Yeah, it's warm. It was cool last night, actually. I had a sweatshirt on last night. I was like cooled down, but I think rumor is I haven't been outside today that it's warm out. It's like 89 or something today, but I don't know. I've yet to break out there at all today. So
so listen, my pool opened this past Saturday. I haven't been yet, but this weekend I will be in the pool. Speaking of being in the pool, hey Jeff,
How are you?
are you still shoveling snow?
We are finally past the snow season. Finally.
All right.
Hopefully not.
Yeah. All right. So welcome back to the podcast, Mr. Jeff Collins. You were on 500. Now you're on 550. You're like a returning megastar.
Or we could just refer to me as a messiah.
Whoa, that got awkward.
that escalated fast.
I know. I think Jeff's starting a cult.
I guess he'll have to be here for 600. I mean, every 50 he's on, right? So
that's right.
True.
We'll have to have him at least another dozen times before this thing is over. All right, Jeff, you and I used to work at well, you still do, but we spent some time together we did some time together at that Chilean prison. But we had some fun with cloud companies in terms of getting stuff migrated. I thought this would be an interesting episode to talk about some of the wacky, unfortunate, and not so right things we see as organizations attempt to take their environment, lift, shift, and forklift their infrastructure and environments out into the public cloud. And I particularly think this is relevant because it's probably been, I don't know, 10 years since we all decided the cloud was going to be everything and the thing. And a lot of organizations are starting to move things seriously. And there's been plenty of interesting discussion on, I don't know if you guys read the articles, but there's a really interesting discussion on LinkedIn recently about Amazon coming out and saying, look, we can't figure out microservices. We're going back to the monolith. As it was, so it shall be. And so let's talk about the security implications for this. Jeff, for those that don't know you, give us a quick background on El Jefe.
Sure. I'm Jeff Collins. I've been playing in the security space for 25 years now, primarily on the infrastructure side, a little bit of application security. That's kind of my history within that regard. And I've gotten to live with cloud security since 2011, maybe 2012, and have visited all kinds of different customers and get to talk about this all the time.
Yeah, Jeff's not a app security guy, but he has stayed in a Holiday Inn Express last night. So
that's true.
So I want to start with this. You guys remember the rush to move everything out into microservices land, and it was all like, oh, you people have VMs, you're so old world, like, get with it. And everything started moving in the direction of paths and then functions and all that stuff. And so we started breaking applications apart. And it turns out, I think the first thing that we learned, because I was a part of that early on, I think the first thing that we learned was nobody really understood how any of this stuff worked together. So when you tried to like pull it apart and say, okay, how does it work together? A lot of people just sort of stared at each other and went, do you know how that works, James? That comes from your part of the world, right? Did you run into this?
I don't think it's ever changed, though. I mean, go back to when development when I first started doing development back in the early 2000s. On
clay tablets?
What did we do? Like, we did monolith applications, but everything was, we had the business access layer, the data access layer, the UI. Like, we broke it all down. It was all still within the same system, but it was the same thing, right? Nobody knew how to do it. Everybody implemented the BAL and the DAO differently across the organization. So now take that and say, here, let's all just go to the cloud, or let's just go to microservices. This will fix everything. But the same story happens again, is that somebody says it, everybody jumps on the bandwagon. You start getting people like, I'll do a project in this because that's the new cool thing, right? But nobody really knows, right? Because everybody's figuring it out at the same time. So they all figured out a different pattern, and then they try to merge it all together, and now everybody's doing it differently, right? And then you start learning the true costs of these things. Like, wow, I didn't realize my Amazon instance was going to cost that much this year because we threw everything in here.
Hey, Jeff, we ran into that a couple of times where the cost savings of the cloud were sort of a lie.
Well, it often happens that way because, when you take something that's monolithic, monolithic infrastructures work really well in CapEx models because they're very static. And when you go to the cloud, it breaks that. And when you go to the cloud and you're very monolithic, we also see this on the security side as well, because that lack of understanding oftentimes burns you in the cloud. As customers bring over a monolithic application, what they'll often do is they'll try to bring over individual microservices in front of it. And those individual microservices, they don't understand the mapping, they don't understand the capabilities, they don't understand what's required. And so what they end up doing is giving full permissions to those workloads. And then we see breaches like we've seen with very many large organizations over the last few years, where an individual resource gets compromised, an individual application gets compromised, and then that gets leveraged throughout the organization purely because they didn't understand. And that's one of the things that, it burns so many companies just because of that lack of understanding. And there's so many tools, so many capabilities out there to understand those pieces that, if you leverage those and you break it down, there's so many opportunities to make that something that doesn't occur.
It was interesting because when I was involved on the engineering side early on, and this was a long time ago, going to the cloud, I should have put that in air quotes, going to the cloud really meant taking your VMware instances from your data center, copying them into Azure, or sorry, AWS rather, or reinstantiating VMs in the cloud and in Azure's environment, and now suddenly you are cloud. When I think in those cases, what we ran into, and I saw most often, was, well, this is safer than on premise, and the argument was actually, no, it's not, because you took the application as it was designed for a castle walls, moat, and drawbridge kind of environment, right? And you use that security model, and you simply moved it to an environment where there was the security around it didn't exist. The security had to be baked into the thing, and it was just somehow magically worse. And so the reactions were bad. And of course there's like, well, where do we put how do we get the firewalls? How do we get security groups? How do we, like, this was all afterthoughts. And because, again, nobody really understood how this stuff actually worked together. It was just, like you said, open up everything in every direction all the time, everywhere. And I think that's how we got a lot of the issues that we ran into.
Well, there was a lot of defaults that weren't there either in those early days, right? I mean, you think about AWS, storage buckets, stuff like that were not secure by default, that were just more of open. Now it's like you got to jump through a hoop to make one of those S3 buckets actually publicly available.
But everybody does it.
They still do it, but at least it wasn't by default.
No, fair.
Right? I think a lot of the argument of being more secure going up into the cloud was less around my application itself is more secure versus maybe I didn't have the resources internally to handle the infrastructure of our data center and all of that stuff. And that now we can give that to the professionals, like put the platform over there. Now we can just deal with the application, right? But then that reveals all of the application issues of, hey, wow, there's a lot of stuff we don't do here that, we really messed up, or trying to go to those buckets or, different storage units. I mean, how many times do we see MongoDBs sitting out there hanging off because people just left it publicly visible, or all those different things?
Well, that's a feature.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was gonna say, isn't that how you made it all work together? Is that you had some stuff that was on-prem, some stuff that was in Azure, some stuff that was in GCP, some stuff that was in AWS, depending on what your developers thought was better for their career, or what they frankly knew. And you had to make it all work together. And I mean, that's really, I don't imagine that's changed much today, though. Like trying to deploy these things, and this was the guys. This is a case study that was so David Hansen, who's the CTO at 37 Signals, published this thing. This was 4 days ago. So on May 4th, I think this was. And it starts out by saying the Prime Video team at Amazon is published a rather remarkable case study of their decision to dump their serverless microservices architecture and replace it with a monolith instead. That move saved them a staggering 90%. More on that in a second, because my head just started to rupture. On operating costs, and simplified the system to what a win. Confetti out of the ears. Like, how did we not? I don't know. Like, how did we not see that?
Well, at the same time, I saw an article this morning. I didn't read the full thing, but somebody posted and said that they didn't actually dump microservices. That they went to a feature-based system, which is what microservices is about, which is feature-based. And so I don't know. Maybe there's some debate. I haven't read fully into it. I did see some of the stuff about it, but I haven't read fully into it to see, like, did they really go back to a monolith, or, or here we are again mincing words of what does microservices mean? And, that's the problem too, right? Everybody's got their own idea of what these things mean. But a concern that we often see, right, is going from private to the cloud, or, local to the cloud, or going from monolith to microservices, right? Are you switching your dev teams?
Yeah.
Right? These are different skill sets to a point of developing a monolith versus developing serverless and microservices and all that. Like, that's different. Any developer could do it, but that's a change in how you do development. So are you changing that as well? And what's the process for that, for your organization to make that switch, to say, hey, we're going to switch and we're going to dump off this 10-year-old huge platform and we're going to start breaking it into tiny little pieces? Are the people on your team ready to make that change?
Well, and I think in that regard, if you think about not just the developers, but you also think about the operational teams behind it as well. I mean, if you take, from a monolithic perspective, you might have, in the example Raf brought up, you might have 50 different functions that exist in an application. The application does these 50 things. Well, when you break that down into 50 microservices, let's assume you do it on a function. So Lambda functions, whatever it may be, dependent on your cloud choice. When you do that, now you have to secure each of those throughout their entire life cycle, from a repo or artifacts all the way through CI/CD, all the way into the function itself, as well as every single dependency against that function. So when you think about from a security perspective, and I think this is what burns a lot of organizations, is organizations see this and they go in and they think about security, and they think about it in the example Raf brought out, which is, I've got a moat and I've got castle walls and I've got all these things. Well, you can't do that now. I've got this repository that may or may not exist in the cloud provider. It may exist in GitHub or GitLab or someone like that. And all of those individual pieces become extremely problematic for the organization to handle, because now we have to deal with security not only after the fact, we also have to deal with security in line. We have to understand these repositories. We have to understand all these dependencies on top of open source software, and all these things happen, and they all culminate in the gaps that we see from a cloud security perspective.
Well, okay, so I think where a lot of the security rigor discipline started to break down was, I think, about a decade ago. And moving forward, we finally started figuring out how to do the like security at the various different places, how to do static analysis, dynamic analysis on applications, how to do the security from the infrastructure perspective, how to reasonably, at least for those highly advanced companies, do data kind of access, right? Identity access management for applications. And then as we broke the legacy infrastructure ways, everything became code, right? I think when you think about the number of configurations, I literally just spent the afternoon watching a customer click through a cloud instance, doing some configuration and stuff like that. We're talking about how the difficulty in getting some just like, I won't say basic, but fundamental things done, and just how many options there are and how many opportunities to completely bork something there are. Now, if you've lived in it for the last decade, you can probably do it with your eyes closed. But if you're somebody new and your boss says, "Hey, we're moving this application to Amazon," you've got 3 months, figure out how to do it. You're going to take the simplest templated kind of route, and I don't know that comes with a whole lot of security features. I mean, Google's kind of one of those that they talk about how it's security is built in the infrastructure. I don't think Amazon cares all that much, and Azure is somewhere in between. But doing the work of figuring out where do you attach some sort of security function, code analysis, web app firewall, network security, that kind of thing, it becomes kind of difficult because it's really easy to break these sort of 7,000 component applications.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, you think about your point on where you do code analysis. I mean, in these types of environments, there's so many different avenues and so many different places you can do it. And there's so many different arenas where if you do it in that spot, you did it in the totally wrong spot. And this is the part that's interesting. And I think this is why so many companies get burned as they go into the cloud. You bring up an example of, you have a workload that you're deploying as a microservice, and that individual workload itself becomes something that basically kills your organization. Because as you go through AWS or Google or Microsoft Azure and you go through their best practices are around a building block. Think of it as a Lego. You have this square Lego that's two pegs wide by 4 pegs long. And they have a security model around that. It's like the big rectangle Lego, Raph, for those that are
squares, rectangles, whatever, close enough.
Whatever, you get the point. But as they go through that, there's a security model around that individual piece. But the problem is that there's a context as to how that piece is being leveraged. And I think this is the piece that really hurts organizations. Because as you think about static analysis, let's assume that you have a pretty standard model. You've got GitHub or GitLab going into Jenkins, ultimately going into a cloud provider, and so on and so forth. And you may be using GitHub Actions in the middle of this, or a workflow or something like that. Well, all those individual pieces have different points where security can be done and should be done, because there's often transformation that's going on to that code as it goes down that path. And I think these are the pieces where it just gets problematic. And what I always tell people to think about is, think about what you have. You've got this individual code, whether it's Node or Python or React or whatever it might be. And you've got this piece of information that you have, this code set. And as that gets deployed, as you're going through those transformational elements, certainly we want to think about and make sure that as we're developing code, that our code is secure inside of the repo, and as it gets pushed and pulled and so on and so forth. But as you go further down to ultimately deploy and you get into runtime, we have to think about how to secure that at that point as well. And I think that ultimately drives additional cost, because now if you have that application that I talked about before that has 50 attributes, you may now have 50 different functions. You now have to secure each of those individual functions. They may all be written in different languages. They may all have different development teams, to James's point, and they probably have very different operational teams because of the constraints associated with that. And as companies go forward, I think the key and the point that they should always think about is, certainly leverage what the cloud providers tell you, but also take the context behind your application and what it's doing and wrap those security tool sets around it. And oftentimes it's going to take third-party tools. You can't secure everything with what the cloud providers provide. You also can't secure everything with what your third-party services may provide, a GitHub, GitLab, Jenkins, so on and so forth. And it's going to take third-party pieces in addition to that in a purely microservices context, let alone some type of hybrid model that may be even further down the line.
This is a particularly sticky point for me because I've more than once had somebody tell me, well, security tool, commercial tools are just not going to be relevant when it comes to the cloud because all the things you need are included by the provider and it's all built in. And I said, okay, great. You call me when that happens. You get me out of retirement, or in some cases, maybe you just dig me out of the earth. And you show me because I'm not ready. I don't think that's happening anytime soon. And as evidenced by the fact that Azure can't even seem to get VTAP to work. Like it's been how long since they pulled it? It is that they're lagging behind everybody else. And these are, I don't know, these are like network basics. Hey, the ability to capture packets on a network for analysis, the ability to like install put an agent on a thing, like the ability to monitor traffic. These are basics. And I know people tell me like, oh, we got to rethink that. We got to rethink it all. You can't do agents anymore. You have to think everything differently. I'm like, but sometimes the old stuff still actually works and it has relevance. I'm not tossing it out just because you think your paradigm is fundamentally shifted. I don't know. Maybe that's just.
I think some of that changes too. I mean, one, depending on the provider that you're using, but two, depending on the level of service you're getting from your provider, right? Oh, you want all that stuff? Sure, that's in the gold package, and you can get that for a mere, $5,000 a minute. You want to sign up for that, right? Like, so, can people afford that? Is it cost prohibitive for people to get into that? And at the same time, to your point, nobody's offering everything that you could get someplace else. It does make me wonder, though, going back to some of our other conversations we had, like, do I get the best in class or do I get a bunch of the I'm okay? Will the providers start getting to that point where they're providing a bunch of the it's okay? It's not
good
the best
enough
class, but they're they're kind of starting to bring that stuff. I mean, look at, you're talking more of like the infrastructure side of this, but think about from the code side of it. When you look at like a GitLab or a GitHub, where they're building all these things that traditionally have been separated out, right? We're getting dependency scanning, we're getting static analysis, we're getting all these different things built into the code repository where it should be, where it should have been. Right now, are they the best compared to some of the external scanners? Maybe not, but is it good enough to be able to get across what we need to do? I mean, if we reference back to the first video I saw this morning about analyzing risk of our vulnerabilities that somebody's got us to think about.
Nice.
Right. It goes all around like, yeah, okay, we have vulnerabilities in here, but do they matter?
Yeah.
We have to figure that out too. So does the best of class give me anything or not?
Well, I think so. The steps, one of the things that I've noticed is organizations that when it's time to like move to the cloud, right? They make the decision, they get a new CIO or something. It's all right, cloud time. If they're already in VMs on premise, like in their data centers, they're gonna go VMs in the cloud, and then they're gonna go to like PaaS, and then at some point they're gonna like dabble in microservices. But if they are physical iron in a data center somewhere, and somebody says go to cloud, they're hiring an entirely new organization of developer, or they're going to completely revolutionize. They're not going to make the small steps. They're going to go full on, like they're going to have the kinds of developers who are like, you don't need anything. You just need functions and an S3 bucket and everything will be great. Jeff, does that match any of the experience you've had?
Well, I think it matches from what people try. I don't think it matches from the realm of having success against it. I mean,
well, that's fair.
When you go down these paths, I mean, you take that old developer adage of well, I'm going to develop in a next generation model and I'm only going to use functions. I'm only going to use buckets and I'm going to build everything. And we shouldn't even use databases. We'll just dump it all in buckets and the application will sort it all out. I mean, we see this all the time. And certainly there's ecosystems where that makes a lot of sense. And I'm a huge proponent of developing in that manner where it makes sense. But that doesn't always mean that that's the most advantageous methodology to do that, nor the most secure. Because unless we really think about what we're trying to do with the application, thinking about how we're going to secure that application and how we're going to secure the underlying infrastructure around it, you can certainly hurt yourself. And we see this happen all the time with other breaches that have happened where they've been burned simply because they built an application that had all of these dependencies that they pulled down from NPM, which is great, but 20% of them had problems, whether they're operational or security problems. And now there's almost no way to troubleshoot that and find that. And so those are some of the things that we often see and just things to be careful about. As you go down this path, you can do whatever you want. I mean, I could go build a car tomorrow and drive it down the road. It doesn't mean I'm not going to kill myself or a busload of nuns, but we should probably just not do that.
I'll tell you, way long time ago, like 2010-ish or so, when .NET came out with partial classes and different features like that, I worked at a company where somebody, this is what I feel causes a lot of this, right? Somebody sees it and like, oh, that's a cool feature, right? And so they're like, we'll do partial classes. So they wrote this monolith app that used partial classes for, like, the entire thing was one partial class. Like every file was all the same partial class. Like you couldn't, an IDE, typically you can right click on something, say, go to reference, find it. No, you had to use search to find anything. Even switching layers, it was a nightmare. Like I was like, somebody doesn't know what partial classes are for. This was not it, but that's what gets, I think, a lot of places in big trouble is somebody sees something and they don't fully understand it, but like, oh, this is the latest thing. I want to do this. And then, you go implement it completely wrong, right? And now it takes forever for this thing to build. You can't use traditional tools because they can't search the system like they normally could, right? Imagine throwing that thing into Veracode where it throws the entire partial class and as one thing into memory to try to do everything, right? So you have that issue. But I wonder how much of it stems back to architects and developers kind of getting bored with the stuff that they're doing. I was a developer. I got bored with writing the same old CRUD type applications. It's like, hey, let's go try security because I'm just doing the same thing over and over and over again. At what point as an architect, you're like, all right, we pretty much designed the monolith here. We're done. We should do something different. Like this will scale better, even though we don't need that scale. We'll be able to, we could scale to support the entire world. We have 5 clients. But we could support everybody.
But we could.
Right? Like you start getting to that, or developers start feeling stagnant. You don't want to go the way of the COBOL developer of, wow, I do COBOL. Nobody except for 5 financial institutions in the world still use it.
I don't know, man.
What do I do?
COBOL, I'd be making more money than I'm making right now. I tell you that right now.
I don't know. I know COBOL programmers, and I don't think that's true.
No? All right.
Maybe ones that are specialized, but I know some that are getting out of it and going into like Java and other things like that. So, maybe that's the case. But again, right? Like you sit too long in a spot, you start to get stagnant in what you're doing. You lose your marketability. You're sitting behind and watching the world pass you by. A lot of people, developers are curious. Hey, I want to do it like this. Oh, we used React forever. Let's switch to Vue. Why not? Like, let's learn that system. I wonder how much of it is some of that.
Jeff, I've run into this, and I'm curious because you've been around some of this nuttiness as long as I have. I've seen what James is talking about, like firsthand. Back when I was at GE, everything was Java though, or like .NET. It was one or the other. But somebody would have this application they wrote 5 years ago, and they have a modernization project, but it was never funded just to modernize. It was funded, that modernization was funded through some additive they wanted to do. Like they wanted to be able to add a shopping cart, or they wanted to be able to create some interface, and they're like, oh, it's too hard to do in our existing ways. Ooh, there's an entirely new programming style or a new style of something. Let's switch everything over to that. And what would happen was, this is one of those fun stories. Like, I remember a couple of revisions before this instance, we had found a bunch of problems in the code, and the dev company, of course, offshore, went through and they made a couple of changes, and they made sure that it didn't, like, they fixed cross-site scripting, SQL injection, basic issues. The application went through modernization. We went back and looked at it again. We're like, hold on. I recall like a year and a half ago, we had this thing and we fixed these bugs were all fixed. And they're like, yes. They're like, oh no, we didn't touch that part of the code. And I'm going, you must, like, something changed. And so I convinced one of the developers to give me a virtual, VNC, if you remember VNC, into their desktop. Like, scroll down. I just wanted, like, I'm not a developer by trade, but I can read code. I'm looking like, whoa, stop. Like, why is all that stuff commented out? It was like, well, we didn't, and it's like, well, we didn't understand what it was, and it seemed to slow the system down. So so we commented it out, and nothing broke. So now it's faster. Like, you guys took the security sanitization methods out. Like, that's why it's faster. Also, you broke everything. But nobody was there at that time, from the before times, like even one version ago, right? They'd written it in some team. Nobody documented it. Nobody created it. Now, can you imagine, you guys, those apps right now going through a cloud migration? I mean,
well, they probably they probably have, and they're going to be the next ones that are going to get compromised. I mean, that's the part that's so scary. And this is what we see across the board. Applications move because, to keep up with the speed of business, you almost are forced to. I feel terrible for IT teams and cloud teams, because all this we talk about, but it's not like they want to do it. They're just trying to keep up with the business. They're trying to do everything they possibly can to keep up. And I think, one of the things I always try to do when I sit down with those teams is, I realize that, you're trying to take something that somebody created, 22,000 moons ago. And, at that point, they wrote something, they put something together, and you're simply the bearer of bad news to take that thing to the cloud. I mean, that's effectively what you are. You basically have to take this thing, you lift and shift it, you move it, and you dump it out there. And, even though you have to do that, I mean, forklifting, the whole concept of forklifting, fixing, and optimizing, it's always so tough because you get into the fix and you get into the optimize realm, and you know nothing about this. It's very monolithic in nature. You have no idea around the dependencies. You have a database stuck in the middle of it on the same exact machine. So not only do you have the top two tiers, you also have the database tier on the same machine. You've got multiple iterations of it that you had a legacy load balancer in front of. You have no idea how it load balances. You have no idea how it works. You have no idea how to patch the thing because, by the way, the last time you patched it was probably during like the Clinton administration. And that's basically where you're sitting. I mean, you're running on a version of Linux that hasn't been supported in 15 years. And we see this all too often, and those get moved to the cloud.
To make it worse, I think it's the security team is, in a lot of cases, is still separated out from the actual development team. Now, having a security architect or security engineering inside these apps is fantastic when it happens. But I'm witnessing it firsthand in the last several months, where it's not. You have security and you have app dev and infrastructure and DevOps and whatever else thing, and these guys and gals put stuff here, and these folks over here figure out what the hell that is and how to build a bubble around it. And it worries me because it, at least in the, look, this is going to sound old and get off my lawn, but so be it. In the old world of the before times, like if a group of folks decided to put an application together that didn't go through security, like it didn't go through review, they didn't get architecture involved, and they're like, okay, we're just going to deploy this. We had the checkpoint. We literally and figuratively, figuratively, because this was the thing that was going to keep applications from going, but we literally had the checkpoint firewall that would, like, I had to give you a public IP or create a rule for you. If my team did not, your app just sat there and like, hello, anybody out there? Like, no, nobody's talking to you because you're isolated from the internet. Today, have credit card will DevOps go, and there's nothing stopping them. So I think this is why attack surface management became such a big thing, is because we're dumping things out there, and nobody knows what it is anymore. Like at least in the good old days, right? I was the bottleneck, but you know what? So be it. At least I was the bottleneck. Now I'm like the guy going, so where do I put this thing? Like, what are all these things out here? And you just don't know.
Yeah, but even then though, right? I mean, that's where web services came from. Security sitting in front saying, I'm not going to open that port for you. I'm not going to do this. Like, fine, I'm going to put a base application out there and I'll just squeeze everything through 443.
Yeah.
And, you'll open that and now you're screwed, right? There's always that, create a bottleneck and I'll find a way around it to get that going. It's how do we sit there and stay with that? I mean, I'm an opinion. I don't think security should be the bottleneck. I don't think they should be the gatekeeper. Right. But we have to have teams that understand the platforms they're going to. You shouldn't be an on-premise team that just jumps out to Azure or AWS or GCP and all of a sudden be like, hey, we're going to start just deploying out here. We don't know what we're doing. Like, there's got to be something built around that before you start going out there. But I think that's the problem, right? We have this carte blanche. Here's the credit card. Like, here, go sign up for this service and start pushing our stuff and let's see what happens.
It'll be cheaper, it'll be faster, it'll be more resilient, but none of it will work.
Well, and I think in that regard, James, I think one of the things that's hard is, as those teams make that transition, to Raf's point, historically, they were the bottleneck. They were that last gatekeeper. When you move to the cloud, you can't be a gatekeeper. It doesn't exist anymore because everything will scale horizontally. And so you have to insert directly into the teams that are developing. I mean, we have this, great marketing term of DevSecOps, which in probably 90% of organizations doesn't exist in any way, shape, or form. And that number is probably really 99%, but I'll be really nice today because it is a Monday. And so, in that regard, you have to think about things and you have to become a catalyst to evolve and to, create opportunity for the business to advance. But from a security perspective, security reinvents itself every day now, especially security teams. Because, if historically you were securing a monolithic workload and tomorrow you're now securing a function, we're dealing with very different attributes. And I think this is one of the most exciting things that I see within our industry. I'll just be honest. I mean, I think in my 25-year career in security, 20 years of it were monotonous of the exact same story. James and I were on parallel paths. He was writing in programming languages. I was dealing with monotonous security, trying to build firewall rules. And, but the reality is that we're finally at a point where, security changes dramatically. A firewall rule is really our last course. And it's probably the course that most of us should never use. I mean, I hate to say that, but the reality is that we've already lost if that's our only defense. Because trying to protect at a port or a protocol level is really tough. And when we think about cloud security, we have to move much more into application security. We have to understand how things are communicating. We actually have to now understand these things called identity, because identity becomes something that every single resource uses to get access to something else. And we have to understand that. We have to understand groups and roles and all those individual attributes that from the world of zero trust says we should do every single day. But within that, I think those are all avenues where, there's so much opportunity, so much ways for each of us to advance, and so much more where we can help accelerate the business as we go to the cloud and really create an opportunity for enhancement to the business.
Yeah. What's interesting, as you described through that, because I agree with that, is even within the security realm of how we change it, right? Like you mentioned DevSecOps, which, depending on who you talk to, one group, it'll sit there and tell you it's the same thing as secure SDLC. We just renamed it security in all the different phases. Other places will tell you something different, but we got DevSecOps, we got product security, we got application security. Traditionally, you'd think application security is really just code reviews, pen testing, like at the code level.
Yeah.
Whereas you'd have product security that would look at more things like infrastructure as code. Like, let me look at the whole thing. I'm looking at Kubernetes. I'm looking at all these different pieces that are sitting here, right? So now we're splitting things up and continuously splitting. And it's like, okay, in my organization, who does what? Does the AppSec team deal with container security, or is that something that the infrastructure team is dealing with, or do we have a DevSecOps team, or do we, you know what I mean? Like you start getting into these things where people are like, well, I'm AppSec. I really just deal with like, if that's not code related, like that's not me, right? I do SaaS, code reviews and this, but if you want container security, that's DevSecOps or that's product security.
So that's an interesting thought, because I was listening to a bunch of security folks try to help somebody through some basic things. I don't say basic, some things in making a product work inside of a new cloud environment. And I was marveling at how difficult of a time the third party was having just doing things. I'm like, I'm not an expert, but I would guess like where to click things. And I said, hey, this is odd. Like, what is it not? Do you guys see this all the time? And he says, this is the problem with very large companies. Big team, everybody's hyper specialized. So literally there was somebody whose job it was to, after the VM was built or after the asset was built, to connect it to the right virtual network, to give it the right routing rules and all that, right? Get in the right, make sure it's in the right VPC, make sure the ENI checks out, make sure it's got a routing table and all this stuff. And I'm going, oh, so the difficulty comes from not like lack of knowledge, but now as it scales, somebody's job is like literally there's somebody, like I just imagining this Laverne and Shirley style assembly line, and literally, things are coming down the assembly line and it's somebody's job. The machine has taken the piece of metal and compressed it into what looks like a bottle cap. And it's somebody's job to go twist, make sure it stays on, right? Like that person doesn't know anything about what's in the bottle, how the bottle was made, whether it's supposed to look green or brown or pink or orange. Like that person knows nothing except for the fact that they need to make sure that they twist it to a certain degree. And I'm seeing that happen right now as people hyper specialize in cloud. And it is I'm going to say at least dangerous, because you try to get any one of these folks to do the whole thing. They're like, I don't know. This is just my piece right here. Like, great. How does that thing work with this other big thing? They're like, I don't know, but this is my job. And I just connect this to this and then I'm out. That's
well,
tough.
that's so risky. And that's so risky because, in today's world, with automation and with orchestration, that's a world where, in 2 years probably won't exist, because that same company is going to realize that, A, you can't afford resources like that, or B, I'm going to use something, that's like remarkable, like Terraform, and I'm going to remove that person's role. Then that was a joke. Sorry for that. But you go down that path, and that's so risky. It's like the switchboard operator. If you think about a phone, we never had 10 digits on our phone. Aunt May picked up the phone, and Clara May down the street patched her through to New York City, and that's how a phone call was made. But it's the same world. But it's the same. Well, I'm not older than James, because we started this off with James was working in tablets with coding initially. So
that's right. James was.
That's right.
Oh, yeah. okay, I mean, yes, maybe. Um,
Is that not what leads to though? Like, I mean, what did we just see? We went through 6 or 8 months of most of the major companies dumping 10 to 15% of their workforce, right? And you don't see a detriment from it, which leads me to conclude that there are probably roles that may not have really need to be there, right? Like we can pick this stuff up. Like that's what's going to happen too. Like an organization, especially those big ones. I've been in those, and you're
Yeah.
like, why do we have like separate, like one person could do 5 of these things? And we got 5 different people. And at some point, somebody different comes in and they look and like, why do we have 5 people doing this? You could do that. What are you doing the rest of the day? And they're like, yep, shop that out and get rid of it. So you have the risk of cost of the business. But then to Raf's point, you have that risk of, I don't know of anything else going on. I know how to do that one thing. And I can't even think out of the box of how could I step back and say, wow, we could really save time if I did it like this, or how's this integrate with that other piece, which tying that back to like the microservices stuff. I mean, think about testing those things, right? I'm testing one Lego brick out of the entire thing that I've built. Each one I'm testing individually. And then I got to figure out how to start doing integration testing and how do these things all, like the complexity that starts getting put into that. There's trade-offs. Monolith.
Yeah, listen, parting thoughts because we're running over on time. Jeff, one for you. As you, or as we look at the world that's coming next, and I'm already hearing people talk about generative AI as what's going to solve the complexity problem in all kinds of places, right? Including the cloud. It is, I'm not going to pretend I believe, AI is going to solve security problems. I don't. Okay. You hear me say it right now. I don't, not the slightest bit. But what I can imagine being able to finally do is, given the massive subset of VMs, functions, PaaS services, identities, VPCs, this, that, and 17 other things, you're going to be able to say from a security perspective, maybe one day, and maybe even soon, which one of, what in my cloud network doesn't follow the pattern I've set forth. So for you, Jeff, I guess the question is, what security tools are still going to be relevant in category in 5 years as this march progresses?
Well, I think from a security tool set perspective, even with AI, you'll still need security tools themselves as the building blocks to feed them. Because remember, AI itself only can take what intelligence that it's given. Security tool sets themselves still have researchers that are going out and they're providing content and they're providing signatures and they're providing intelligence to their platform that they create. Now, I'm not saying that those researchers over time will also not be replaced with AI, but if we just talk about AI from a core overarching perspective, AI itself won't replace that. But there are a lot of pieces that today that we already see where AI or ML components are being leveraged within organizations. We see this from an identity perspective. If you have an identity inside of a cloud provider, you can accurately understand the scope of that identity throughout your entire organization, the risk of that identity, how that identity is leveraged, and how that's changed across. And that's not just within a cloud provider. You can do that across your entire organization. Now, some aspects of your organization may not support that capability just because of the legacy component, but we see that today. And you could go down that path in a lot of various areas. Where we still have a gap is looking at this holistically. And I think that's where things like AI will help add in some additional context and clarity across those multitudes of systems. And we've already started seeing pieces of that. I mean, if you just go out and use your favorite Google searcheroo and you go in and you perform that against some type of, whatever you want to use, Bard, Chat GPT, whatever you want to use, and you want to look at, core cloud security and is my cloud safe, and looking through those underlying pieces. I don't necessarily know if I would feed that data into those platforms today, but if you do so choose, go right ahead. And you could leverage that, and you could get some intelligence around that. I think that world's coming sooner than we actually think. I would bet anything right now that within the next year, assuming that all AI doesn't get shut down by the government within the next year, but assuming that doesn't happen, I think there's a pretty good chance of that happening at a holistic scale in a large portion of our environment. Now, it's still going to require all the underlying tools below it, like I mentioned before, but I think there's a tremendous opportunity for that.
James, any thoughts you want to add on top of that? Because I think that's pretty extensive.
Yeah, I don't know if there's much I'm going to add to what I think you covered it pretty well.
All right. Well, Jeff, thanks for joining us. As always, good to have you on, and nice to see your smiling face from our bunker.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me on.
All right, folks, thanks for listening. 550. I can't believe we've done 550 of these. Hey, there is a new thing I've started on the YouTube channel called I've Been Thinking. It's like a 60-second spot of just random things that cross my mind, or somebody's, I see somewhere, and I just want to instigate you guys here to use some brain power. As James hinted, the recent one is the first one really is the one about vulnerability prioritization, because there are 925 or so, I think, CISA known exploited vulnerabilities out there. And it's like, wow, that's a big number, but how many of those actually matter to people? And I guess the cloud, and what we were talking about, it's not much different. So go check that out, either on the LinkedIn page or on YouTube. Leave some thoughts. Feel free to kick off a discussion. It might be fun. You might learn something. And all right, until next time, we'll catch you guys on another Down the Security Rabbit